Hello, I'm here to share some of my favorite games, my favorite tabletop role playing games from 2019 with you. Not all of these games were published in the year 2019, but they are when I picked them up and started playing them. They're all available for sale. I will explain where as we go through this list. And I picked a few of them in no particular order. They're all quality games, quality for different reasons. They have very different play experiences, and so I thought there was no real point in ranking them. Just going to explain why I enjoyed them. Let's go on and take a look at the first game. So this is Macchiato Monsters. Some of you may have seen my review of this game on this channel, and you'll know that I enjoyed it quite a lot. I played it very extensively in the first half of 2019. It is an OSR game, old school Renaissance, old school revival. Which is to say that it's quite similar to basic Dungeons and Dragons. However, it has a lot of rules innovations that you won't find in your old D&D from the 70s and 80s. To just very briefly summarize what I enjoyed about this game, for the details, again, you can go check out my review. I first of all thought that its heavy use of risk dice was very effective in promoting interesting decisions in play. So, risk dice, for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea, are you use the full range of polyhedral dice. Generally speaking, you're going to use the D4 up to the D12. There may be cases where you use the D20. And for each die type, that counts as like how much of a thing there is in the game. So if you roll 1 to 3 on any die, then it steps it down to the lower type, and that resource or that effect is reduced in some way in the game. So, for example, let's say I have 1d6 of bread. My character eats the bread, so I roll my d6, and the first time I get a 5. Great, I recover 5 HP, and my bread is not exhausted. However, the second time I roll, I get a 2, so I have consumed some of my bread, and then it goes down from a d6 to a d4. Once you hit the 1 to 3 on the d4, then it's exhausted. For certain risk dice, if you roll the maximum number, it will step up. So, for example, for morale, if you test morale, like a follower's morale in the game, you get a 6, it's a d6, you get a 6, it goes up to a d8. Of course, that doesn't apply to everything. You don't get more bread by eating bread. But that's basically how the risk dice work. They can go up, they can go down in step. And what it does is it introduces an element of risk or probability into resource consumption. So I think this is very effectively used throughout Macchiato Monsters. You see it used in encounter risk dice, which dictates sort of like the level of risk, the ambient level of risk in a dungeon or an area that you're in. Money risk dice, these dictate how you spend your money. It allows for a lot of resource management in terms of managing encumbrance, in terms of managing funds, similar to like you might have in Burning Wheel. And it introduces an element of calculation and decision, interesting decision, into money use that you're not going to find in a system where it's just, oh, you've got 20 CP, okay, you spend 4 CP, you get a night's rest in the inn. That's, not that interesting. It's just a simple matter of subtraction. There's a little bit of budgeting there, but once you introduce those risk dice into the equation, then It gives you a lot more options. It gives you a lot more decisions to make. And I find that to be very enjoyable. Another type that it uses is the item risk die. It's just like the bread I was talking about. Morale risk die I already mentioned, and then faith or trinket risk dice for casting. So very simple rules are used to delineate the difference between divine casting and arcane casting in the game, but it works wonders in terms of getting the flavor of what those mechanics are intended to convey. The way that faith casting works is clearly distinct from the way that arcane casting works, and it's just like, 4 or 5 little rules that you need to follow. There's nothing super complicated, but by using the risk dice in an interesting manner and having them behave differently for each casting type, it really feels like, yes, the fictional difference between the two is reflected in a mechanical difference between the two. Essentially, what ends up happening is with faith, you have one risk die that you use for all your casting. However, you have more different actions you can do with that. You also have the ability to increase your risk die in ways that you cannot with arcane casting. Arcane casting, you're going to have like your magical foci, and you can use those to cast without taking HP damage. However, they're not going to be restored as easily, and so it's kind of like you have a broader range of options as like a wizard or whatever for casting magic than you would if you were like a cleric, basically a faith caster. However, you don't have access to interesting things like, getting advantage on rolls because your god is helping you. Any case, 2 different magic systems, basically just made possible for intelligent use of the risk die mechanic. And this really speaks to one of the other things I think is very strong about Macchiato Monsters. It's that systems function well together and they have implications for one another that are considered, they're not just accidental. I played so many games in 2019, so many tabletop RPGs where systems just did not function well together. They clashed with each other, or it was clear that there hadn't been forethought put into how they would interact with one another. And I find that incredibly frustrating as a player and as a GM. It's just, I feel like I have to make my own rulings, and I'm kind of left thinking like, why was this game brought to market? Why was it sold? Why was it put out there for use without, this really sort of like taking a step back and seeing how does System A interact with System B? There's none of those problems in Macchiato Monsters. It's not a matter of game balance, but the decisions you make in one system of the game have sort of like clear and understandable implications for other systems of the game. So for example, when you are choosing your items in character creation, you're going to have a full run from a D20 down to a D4 of dice that you can allocate to different item categories. Now, on first glance, it would seem that you should allocate as many as possible to the equipment and food table because that's going to give you the most stuff. However, your encumbrance in the game is determined by your constitution stat. So, you cannot have more item slots that will not risk encumbrance than you have constitution. So what that means is, yes, at first glance, you could allocate as many dice as you wanted to food and equipment, but your constitution score actually constrains how many times you want to buy into that table. That's sort of one system playing off of another system. You see it throughout the game, and it makes you just sort of like interact with every little part of it in a considered way. and you always feel like there's a new and interesting decision to be made mechanically without there being a ton of rules that is going to bog down play. Speaking of which, the Constitution stat, it doesn't directly determine your HP, but you can spend Constitution to reroll your hit dice. Constitution is going to determine your encumbrance, your maximum encumbrance. Constitution is possibly a casting stat. Constitution can also helps determine whether you live or die when you're reduced to 0 HP. So, like, not only are there not really dump stats, the stats are actually effective in many different areas of the game. And it feels like that isn't just, slapdash. It's actually considered. And as I said before, I found that the divine and arcane casting were just very elegant rules that clearly conveyed their thematic content while also having distinct mechanical content. So there's plenty of that throughout the game. I think it is a very well-made game. For some people, it may seem a little bit too crunchy, a little bit too bogged down by these interesting decisions that I was talking about. And the character creation can run a little bit on the longer side because you tend to choose items and then go back and revise your character creation choices based on that. But overall, I think that Macchiato Monsters is my favorite OSR game. I've played quite a few. I played Knave this year. I played also Delvers, kind of an OSR game. I played it's escaping me at the moment. That's Space One, based on World of Dungeons. And while those are all interesting games, I think Macchiato Monsters is far and away my favorite. So, great game. Check it out. I would highly recommend it. And if you're on the fence, you can always check out my review. So the next game I want to talk about here is Spindle Wheel Micro Games. Yeah. So this is another one of my favorites from this year. I've played it a few times and really enjoyed it every time. Was at a con in the spring, and this was like my favorite game by far. This one's written by Sacha Renaud, and I think Sacha is one of the best designers out there working right now. Now, why do I think that? Well, first of all, they're very smart, but second of all, it really shows in the design of these micro games. Now, Spindle Wheel, as is described, is a tarot-like interpretive storytelling game where you use the cards as anchors to weave a story with your friends. Included in this collection are 5 games. Each of these games is distinct, but it all relies on these tarot-like cards. So, those of you who've done tarot before, you know that there's the major and minor arcana, and each card in those sets is supposed to have certain meanings attached to it. Now, when you're doing tarot, you would normally have to look in a separate book or have it memorized what each card means. But in Spindle Wheel, there are new cards that are not tarot cards. They're completely new. And they have 2 meanings written on them. So they have the name of the card, and then one meaning at the top and one meaning at the bottom. So whenever you draw one of the cards, you as the player get to decide which of those 2 meanings you want to use, or if you just want to discard the card and draw another for inspiration. The cards work purely as an oracle, and you're not bound to stick with one for any given reason. Then, similar to tarot, you are going to place the card in a spread. So you can see an example of a spread here from the game Detective. So there is an order of play that's dictated by the game. And so, for example, the first card that I would draw would be the scene. And the scene says the state of the body where it was found. So the murder victim. What was the state of the body? Where was it found? I draw a card and it says, two different things on it and the name of the card. I get to pick which one I think is interesting for the scene. And then I lay that down and I give a little description of what I think the scene looks like, interpreting that card. So the card is an inspiration for that scene. As you go along the spread, each different thing, each different point in the spread has its own meaning, but there's also parts where you get to choose which areas you want to explore first. And, it's all directed by the players. The cards are just there as an oracle. And I think it creates really interesting story collaboration between everybody at the table. It's very easy to pick up and play if you're familiar with whatever genre it's drawing on. So detective, if you've seen a police procedural, then you can probably play this game. And you go around the table, everybody drawing, everybody narrating, and you're just kind of riffing off of each other's ideas, riffing off of the oracle. It's very smooth, and it produces really satisfying fiction. So there's no heavy mechanical crunch or anything here. It's just a game you can pick up and play easily and enjoy a lot. So the games that I have played are the one up on the screen right now, Detective. And another one of the games is The Mountain. Right there, you can see it. Detective, my thoughts on that are it's very fast, it's very easy, and it creates fun collaboration on a nuanced detective story. So the interesting thing with Detective is that you explore two sides of the murder victim's life. You explore the boon side, which is like the things that were helping him out, or her out, or them out, or whatever, in a positive way in their life, right? So, friends, things that were going well at work, their positive personality traits, all that kind of stuff. Then you had the bane, which is the things that were working towards their doom. Now, of course, they've already died, but by seeing both the positive and negative side of their lives, then you get to kind of create a really nuanced character that you're, as the detectives, exploring. So you're writing the fiction as you go, but it's not just like pat, it's not just very one-dimensional. Having those two dimensions to the character really helps to build something that feels true to a police procedural and the kinds of stories you would find there. It's very easy to do. So the other game I played was The Mountain. The mountain, you are a god locked in the peak of a mountain. You are its followers, scaling the mountain to free your god. Essentially, in this game, you have a kind of mountain-like spread, and one player is going to control a group of followers who are trying to reach the summit to free the god, and the other player plays the god who is creating challenges for the followers to overcome. It's kind of like a Pilgrim's Progress sort of deal, except as you ascend up the mountain, some people are going to get left behind, some people are going to have to sacrifice themselves. There's all this adversity that gets introduced, and it's a really fun way to create sort of like epic fantasy fiction. Very stark contrast, just big palette, lots of big themes. You can really ham it up when you're playing as the god and creating challenges for the followers. It's a whole lot of fun, and it's exploring a dimension of fantasy stories that I think a lot of people like to explore in games like D&D, but this just gets away from all of the like baggage and structure and scaffold that you bring when you're playing a really crunchy game. and it just gets rid of all that stuff, and it just says, hey, why don't we tell a story about an imprisoned god and their followers or whatever, right? It's very fast. It's like 30 to 60 minutes, and you get this cool dramatic story. So interested in checking out these other games, Ghost Train and Meet Me in the Field of Honor at Dawn. I would definitely recommend checking out Spindle Wheel Microgames. There's a lot of active community development of cards and of games for this system. It's basically a toolkit that can be used to create many different micro games. So if you're interested in that dimension, I would recommend it. But overall, excellent game. One of my favorites of the year for sure. So the final game that I want to talk about here is Beam Saber by Austin Ramsey. And some of you may have already heard about this game because it will be on the upcoming season of Friends at the Table, the actual play podcast. And this is it says Beam Saber is a Forged in the Dark game about the pilots of powerful machines in a war that dominates every facet of life. They are trying to do their part, then get out physically and mentally intact. The organizations that perpetuate the war throughout all of known space are too incomprehensibly huge to take down. There is no winning the war, there's only surviving it. Hopefully, you can help others get out too. So that's the pitch for this game. Essentially, this is a Gundam game. This is a Gundam TRPG that leans towards the style of 08th MS Team. There's a little bit of Zeta Gundam you can kind of feel in there. And there's actually something that's not Gundam. There's some influence from Legend of the Galactic Heroes that you can see in here as well. So basically, it is a very anime mech game. And I think it succeeds very well at this task, right? Of producing an anime mech experience, producing a Gundam-like experience. I've played probably about 40 to 50 hours of Beam Saber at this point, and I really like the game quite a lot. So as I said, it has the right amount of anime exuberance and tragic melodrama. So there is the flashy side of Gundam definitely comes through in here, but there's also the tragedy and the melodrama, the over-the-top character relationships. It is all present here, and if that's what you're looking for, this is the game for you, right? I think it succeeds very well because it has a clear design vision. It's aiming for that kind of play experience. It's not aiming to be a universal mecha game. It's aiming to be something like a Gundam game, right? And I don't think it succeeds because it's using a Forged in the Dark system, the system that was developed out of Blades in the Dark, but because it customizes that system intelligently. It's not a shopping game, right? It's not it's not one of these mecha games like Armored Core that, or say like Mech Warrior, that would really focus in on choosing the right parts for your mech and customizing your mech. It's not like Lancer, right? Lancer is a game that came out this year and has a really interesting in-depth mech customization system. That's not what this game is about. This game is about the war. It is about the pilots. It is about the melodrama. It is about the tragedy, and it is about big anime action. Like many Forged in the Dark or Powered by the Apocalypse games, Beam Saber is not a game that gives you a lot of mechanical room for character advancement. The most significant development you're going to get with your character isn't through like leveling up and advancing so much as it is taking statuses from getting stress and stressing out, right? In Blaze in the Dark, these would be traumas, right? So, in my experience with playing Forged in the Dark games, that's where like the really big character shifts go. I was just playing a campaign of Beam Saber, and after I got my first status, my character was out of the campaign in pretty short order because her perspective on the world fundamentally changed because of that status, and she just decided she was not in. She was not in for fighting the war any longer. She wanted out, and so she got out. Those kinds of status changes really affect the direction of the narrative in a way that something like getting an extra +1 to your action rating or an extra special ability do not. So if you're wondering, like, where's the character development going to happen in Beam Saber, it's really that interaction with the war through the stress system that is going to drive it the most strongly. There's a similar story for vehicles, or what we would usually call mecha vehicles here, because you can do a different thing that's not like a bipedal fighting robot. My last character in Beam Saber flew a helicopter, and that worked just fine. That's one of the upsides of having a system that is not really focused on that shopping and customizing and weapons loadout and all that kind of stuff. It's very easy and flexible to just be like, yeah, my vehicle is not a bipedal robot. My vehicle is a helicopter, and it's like, cool, I can do that in this system. It's really easy to make that character. The vehicles, similar to the characters, are flavorful but fairly static mechanically. It's like you make your vehicle, and then that's your vehicle, and you can advance it in interesting ways through long-term projects. But that's not really where the core of gameplay is. Like, it might be an interesting motivation for your character, it might get you a cool scene down the way, but that's not the focus of play. The focus of play is what are the cool parts about your vehicle, and how does it affect your character, and how does it interact with the world. All right. One major change in Beam Saber compared to other Forged in the Dark games is you'll see up here on the character sheet, if I zoom in a bit, that there are action ratings similar to Blaze in the Dark, but then additional, and these count for your pilot, but then additionally, oops, there we go. There are action ratings to use with your vehicle. So there's actually quite a lot of action ratings, and you do get extra points at character creation to fill in these vehicle action ratings. Now, this is important because any mecha TRPG is going to suffer a certain amount of rules bloat because you need to have a system to represent pilot actions, and you need to have a system to represent vehicle or mecha actions. I think that Beam Saber does a very good job of restricting that bloat as much as possible. So what does it do? So as I said, there's the pilot actions. That's just like Blades in the Dark. There's really nothing too interesting to say about it. But on the vehicle side, you have these actions: battle, destroy, maneuver, bombard, manipulate, and scan. You can only use these actions when you are in your vehicle and doing things with your vehicle. Additionally, your vehicle has what are called quirks. These quirks are like traits that can act as in a positive or negative way. So if you think about what do you call it? There's something very similar in Fate, and the name is just escaping me at the moment. But they're basic. Oh, aspects. You have aspects of your character in Fate. They can work to your advantage or your disadvantage. Quirks are a lot like that, but for your vehicle. And what that does is it just lets you go up and write whatever you like in that quirk box and say, yeah, my helicopter is silent running. Okay, that's a thing it can do, right? And when it's appropriate, you can tap that for a dice advantage or to resist consequences. So unlike in Blades, you don't always spend stress to resist consequences. When you're doing things with your vehicle, you spend your quirks to resist consequences. So that creates an interesting mechanical and play distinction between the pilot side and the vehicle side. And with just a few rules, right? There's not too much there. It is more complicated than Blades in the Dark, but when you compare it with something like, oh, I don't know, the entirety of Mech Warrior combined with the entirety of Battletech, right? It's pretty simple, and it's pretty easy to pick up and play. So I think that Austin did an excellent job of keeping the rules bloat down and still getting the flavor of the vehicle across in play and making this feel like a mecha game. Now, another thing I would like to mention about Beam Saber is that it has these territories on one planet, and that's where the game takes place. This has a really similar effect to the whole game being set in Dosfall in Blades in the Dark. It's just to say there's a constrained area that you are operating in, and each part of that area, the different territories on Earth, in the case of the default setting, have their own attributes and sort of knowable aspects. I really like this because it's not so much that I'm concerned about my party being a bunch of murder hobos and going from place to place wreaking havoc, because the game's really constrained in terms of what you can do. You're just a tiny cog in the war machine. It's more that like it gives me a clear sense as a GM and as a player what the space is we're playing in and what the stakes are. When I look at something like Lancer, yes, it has a very interesting setting. I like the setting, I like the factions, I like the fiction. However, it's so incredibly vast that I have a very difficult time as a GM understanding how my player group fits into that setting and what the stakes are for them when there's like thousands of other planets to consider, right? By just narrowing it down to one planet, I think that Beam Saber really helps to establish stakes and makes the game very tractable in a way that like a space science fiction game can struggle to achieve. So I definitely appreciate that a lot about Beam Saber's approach. And so speaking of the scenario, you have the factions. So each of the factions is based off of like an ideal type from like sociology, right? So you have like corporatocracy, you have oligarchy, you have monarchy, you have what else? Theocracy and so on, and democracy, right? So those are your factions, for political science or from sociology. And each of those factions has a clear mechanical flavor and has a clear agenda. Then within those factions, you have squads. And those squads each have their own agendas and their own characteristics. They have tiers similar to the way that other crews or factions would have in Blades in the Dark. And each faction has within it a bunch of different squads, and they're ranked from tier 1 up to tier 5. Your play group is going to decide, it's going to pick and choose, oh, these are the factions we think are interesting, and these are the ones we're going to bring into play. In practice, especially if you're playing an independent squad, which is unaffiliated to any one faction, I find that the number of squads you get involved with, it tends to inflate quite a bit. And that can mean that the GM's doing quite a lot of work to track them. But for the basic type of play where you're just a member of one of the factions, you can get like a sort of appropriate number and then just sort of say, oh, these 15 other factions that are on the list, we're not going to worry about those right now. We're just going to narrow it down to the ones we're interested in. And speaking of those relationships, there's one more thing that is really worth noting. It's the rivals mechanic in this game. So rivals are characters that are very difficult to kill. Each character on each PC has one attached to them that represents, some major tense relationship that they have. And they're very difficult to kill. And they can inflict consequences at will. Like it's not like on a failed roll they inflict consequences. They can just inflict consequences. Now that sounds kind of unfun, but remember you have more consequences that you can soak because you have quirks plus your stress track that you would have in Blades in the Dark. The rivals really do create like larger than life relationships, and they add a lot to the feeling of this being a Gundam game, of this being an over the top anime melodrama in a way that you say like you wouldn't get in Blades in the Dark, and it's very satisfying. Whenever you as a player run into a rival, you're like, oh no, not again, but you're also excited to see how the conflict between you is going to turn out, how the sparks are going to fly. Now, finally, the last thing I want to mention in terms of character relationships are cutting loose scenes. So these replace indulging in your vice, and they mandate that two pilots have to act together in order to reduce stress in downtime. So this is like, you get a cool little character scene together and then you reduce stress. It's pretty simple, but what it does do is it gives you those nice little character relationship scenes that do build up your mechanical relationship with each other in the game. And they're kind of reminiscent of the character connection scenes that you would see in like Fire Emblem Three Houses. Those are a lot of fun to do. And again, it's like you can kind of like build up your social links, so to speak, and it's a good time. So I think that Beam Saber is very successful at navigating the difficulties of making a mecha game. It keeps the mechanical bloat down. It's very clear about what kind of mecha fiction it's going for, which is this Gundam / Legend of the Galactic Heroes style story. And it also succeeds at creating interesting character relationships and at establishing a clear situation for play, both socially and physically, that really makes the GM's work a lot easier. So I would highly recommend Beam Saber if you are okay with a game that is slightly higher on the crunch side of things, but perhaps a bit lower than some mecha games. So those are my 3 games that I thought really stood out for me this year that I played. I would say yes. So again, those are Macchiato Monsters by Eric Newton. Sorry, I had a bit of a mind fart there. Spindle Wheel and by Sacha Renaud, and Beam Saber by Austin Ramsey. So check those out. Macchiato Monsters is available on drive-thru. The other 2 games are available on itch, and both of those are currently in beta. So I'll have the links down below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the new year.